so far, it's good to keep in mind that it has only been 6 months. But in terms of rhetoric and narrative, it's all the right things that you want to hear. From the inception of this election campaign, they've been running on a very strong anti-corruption and clean governance party line. So all of that is hopeful in a way that we haven't seen in a long time or ever before. We've seen certain things such as, the president's promise to keep to 22 cabinet ministers, to prevent misuse of funds and to prevent wastages. We've seen things like the initiation of an independent prosecution office, which is a huge step forward and which is a critical reform that is needed. We've seen the first steps to establishing such an office. We've heard from police and law enforcement that they feel freer from political influence and they feel there is more political will, which enables them to do their jobs and investigate free from influence, which is also a big step forward. We've seen a lot of revelations also, things coming out in reports, especially parliamentary committee reports about alleged corruption and mishandling of funds. We've seen a lot of revelation, but then on the other hand, we also need to see follow-up action, which is crucial, I think, in the coming months. We've seen concerning things as well. Specifically, I think recently what's gained a lot of traction is a conflict of interest that exists in the within the president's the role of the president's senior economic advisor with vested interests in the private sector, and how access to sensitive information that he would probably have during his advisory role, how that would play into his role in the private sector. Would it give them an unfair competitive advantage? Things like that. Those are concerning. Then we have the Clean Sri Lanka initiative, which again in rhetoric and narrative is encouraging, but the lack of information and clarity and visibility in terms of what it actually entails, what are the anti-corruption measures, what are the steps that are being taken. We have this very vague and broad initiative that looks good for messaging, but what are the actual steps? What are the objectives? What are the activities that will actually lead to a clean Sri Lanka or clean governance as it claims to? I think what we have now, what we probably didn't have before, is a top-down sort of approach, stemming from the president himself, who again, has this very strong anti-corruption and clean governance stance. That's a big step forward, that it stems from the top, that high level is relatively cleaner, and that'll trickle down to low-level and mid-level public officials as well. In terms of society and that idea that corruption is normal, I think that also stems from a severe deficiency of public trust in the government, right? Since independence, Sri Lanka has only known that corruption is essential to get things done in this country, and that cannot be changed overnight, and that cannot be changed by just a change in the administration. Right? There needs to be changes in the public sector, in how public institutions operate, and there needs to be accountability. The public needs to see high-level accountability, to see prosecution, to see punishment for actual corruption and financial crimes, for them to actually believe and change that mindset of corruption being normal. So it takes a lot of capacitating of the public institutions and public sector, to remove resistance that exists in the public sector, to be more transparent and accountable. We often see when calls for transparency and accountability, like for example through RTIs, which is a huge anti-corruption tool, which is a main anti-corruption tool, there's a lot of resistance by the public sector because they feel like it's an indictment on them. So that change needs to come through changing the understanding and why transparency and accountability is important for governance, and it's not as an indictment on the public sector or public officials. So that change needs to be made by, it can be capacity building or just knowledge sharing in terms of making that connection between transparency and better governance. And yeah, like I said, for the public, it's a lot to do with public trust. They need to see that people are being held accountable and that corruption will be punished as opposed to rewarded. When that tangible change is seen and trust is built, is when I think that idea that corruption is normal in Sri Lanka can change. So, in terms of cases being dismissed, if they're by the courts, then it can be, it's usually because that burden of proof hasn't been satisfied, right? And the lack of evidence can be one of those reasons as to why. But if what we see is more than cases being dismissed by the courts, I think what we see is cases being withdrawn. So two main entities that we look at in terms of prosecuting corruption cases is the Attorney General of Sri Lanka and the CIABOC, which is the Commission to Investigate Allegations of Bribery or Corruption. So the CIABOC and AG, we have consistently seen citing lack of evidence to withdraw cases that they've already initiated. The issue here is that's rather contradictory, right? Because when deciding whether to pursue a case, whether to prosecute a case, evidence that exists is always taken into account. It is what's taken into account. It's analyzed, and based on that evidence, that decision to prosecute is taken. So once that decision to prosecute is taken, then citing lack of evidence in terms of withdrawing is deeply problematic. And it can either be for two main reasons, which is gross mismanagement of the investigation, that it has fallen apart, or political influence and interference that has resulted in this withdrawal. So both of those things need to be addressed in order for cases to actually see progress. Now, in the case of the AG, the Attorney General, a huge issue, again, which is starting to be addressed, is that there is an inherent conflict of interest in the role of the AG in Sri Lanka. So the AG acts as the chief prosecutor in the country as well as the chief legal advisor to the government. So that in itself it basically hamstrings the AG in prosecuting high-level corruption cases. That inherent conflict of interest in itself makes sure that there is that the AG cannot operate independently. So that critical governance reform, judicial reform, needs to happen where we establish an independent prosecution office, and there are being steps being taken for the first time to do that, and hopefully we will see progress on that, and also that progress will be reported by the government. And the second entity, right, is the CIABOC, the Bribery Commission. The Bribery Commission has suo motu powers, right? So which means they can prosecute cases, they can initiate investigations on their own volition. We haven't seen these powers being utilized to its full effect. We have seen cases being instituted and then withdrawn due to a lack of evidence. This has been a recurring issue with the CIABOC, and they have cited issues like lack of capacity and lack of resources as the reason for this. But at a glance, I think in the 2025 budget estimates, the CIABOC has been allocated significantly more than funds than they have in the previous years. So that's a good sign from the current government as well, and hopefully fixes the issues that the CIABOC have claimed to have in terms of hindering their investigations and prosecutions. Yeah, certainly. The private sector is definitely responsible for the level of corruption in Sri Lanka, and usually the private sector takes on either or both roles of either enabler or a perpetrator of corruption, and recently and progressively we've seen that they're more a perpetrator rather than simply an enabler of corruption. There are loopholes that exist not only in the governance of the public sector, but in the governance of the private sector as well, that are manipulated and taken advantage of for private gain, for profit. And the onus is on the private sector as much as it is on the public sector and the government to curb corruption and to not engage in corrupt activities. We're expecting new laws, we're expecting new mechanisms like a beneficial ownership register, which we're expecting through a Companies Act amendment, which will basically document and make public the true individual, the human owner behind any company or any entity. So the private sector has to enthusiastically comply with these provisions, with these mechanisms of transparency and accountability. We have new procurement guidelines, we have a new procurement law coming up. These need to be complied with by the private sector just as much as the public sector. We can't bypass procurement protocols. You can't use connections in terms of getting government tenders. There needs to be, again, high compliance and enthusiastic compliance by the private sector just as much as the public sector. There has to be stronger legislation for the recovery of stolen assets. It's actually a commitment that the Sri Lankan government has made under the IMF program, and last month, the end of February actually, a proceeds of crime bill was gazetted. This bill, what it basically does, a law like this, is it creates the mechanisms and the landscape that is needed in order to initiate investigations and then recover and bring back stolen assets, and to either its rightful victim, if there is a direct victim, or it comes back, it's appropriated to the treasury, which means the beneficiary is the Sri Lankan people. So there are various mechanisms. There is a process of fact finding with when you find an asset that can possibly be a proceeds of crime. The investigation officers conduct fact findings. They have the power to seize, they have the power to freeze through judicial orders, and they also have the power, finally, which is the law gives the state the power to forfeit assets. And there are two types of forfeiture. There's non-conviction based forfeiture and as well as conviction based forfeiture. Now this is really important as a salient feature because non-conviction based forfeiture is integral to proceeds of crime, to successful asset recovery, because the focus of a law like this has to be on the property as opposed to the person. So a criminal conviction isn't necessarily needed for a property to be seized if it can be proven to be a proceed of crime. Another important thing about a law like this is that it establishes international cooperation. It establishes the premise for international cooperation, which is integral if we are to recover stolen assets that have been laundered and stashed in other countries. What's needed for anything like this, any law like this to work, is political will, right? Because with no political will, there cannot be the initiation of the recovery of stolen assets, especially because there has to be international cooperation. Mutual legal assistance agreements have to be signed, and that only can come from the highest level of governance in the country. And without that, true asset recovery is just not possible. So a true test of this government's political will be the fast implementation of this law, signing mutual legal assistance agreements as soon as possible, and initiating these proceedings, because it is a huge part of justice in terms of corruption and financial crime.